catechism. We learn through song. That's culture, right? And so what happens is that this is at the University of Mississippi. This was a Confederate statue that was there. When I went to class, I had to pass a Confederate statue. Okay, and it was just interesting. First of all, I want you to take, it weighs 40,000 pounds high. So when you're looking up, now imagine just the majesty when you look at the sky. But then when you're looking up and you're now looking at this Confederate statue, and I want you to look at the pose. Looking over, a constant eye. Watching what? Guarding what? And we call them, here I have statue, but we call them memorials. And memorials is a different word than a monument, what you see in the news, than a statue. Just think about memorials when you go to a memorial service. There's a level of veneration, praise, acknowledgement, right? Not only in physical peace, but in spirit. And so here's the Confederate statue that stood. Now, the issue is, that lets me know that the University of Mississippi in its origins was not for me. It was not for me. So how do I now go and navigate space in a place that was not for me? Now, I want to take you, right? And I want to acknowledge before we move forward. Many of you who are sitting in this class, you're in my 1960s class. Now, the fact that WCU has a sustainability office, you already have learned about COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program. Amy, I think you want to go to the next slide. And so what happens is that you go into the counterintelligence program. Now, the reason that environmental groups were in the COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program that was there by the FBI, to basically to gear surveillance to groups that they saw that was counter to America, counter to any type of level of progression, and against the status quo. The reason that they were environmental groups for hit was because you're now talking about resources. See, when you deal with sustainability, you're dealing with resources. Oftentimes you're dealing with governmental legislation, you're dealing with economics, and that can be a threat. Now, if you don't believe me, let's go and see what's happening at Russia and the Ukraine right now. You look at Russia, and that is a question of really sustainability. It's a story of history, Russia's relationship with the Ukraine, and also the sources and resources. So sustainability, they actually even, the COINTELPRO even had they gave, pejorative terms that people who looked after the environment, somebody like Rachel Carson, who, basically she was dying of cancer, and she was trying to say, look, don't spread DDT. And they went after a campaign against her, the corporates and the federal government and congressmen went after her with full force, and she was dying of cancer, but she didn't let them know, because that wasn't their business. Was their business is to handle that DDT. So the reason that you're looking at like the counterintelligence program, and why when you look at environmental groups, right, why they were in the crosshairs of the government, is because you're now talking about resources and you're talking about corporate interests. So therefore, that could be going against the status quo. Therefore, they now went into the crosshairs of COINTELPRO. So the fact that now we have a program and we have an office that now I saw that, we see the things on campus. What do they say? We're monitoring, we're looking at our carbon footprint. You understand that that's radical. You understand that that's radical. Not only is it deliberate and intentional, but it's radical. Okay? And so therefore, I would like to thank the office for bringing me here so I can have this conversation, because, I am one of the things that you even have, one of the languages that came out was that, oh, those tree huggers. Well, I'm one and I'm happy. And I love fresh water and I love fresh air. And I think it's like we are custodians of this, right? We're not, and so you have all of these pieces here. So I thank the author for bringing me here. I want to take you to my hometown of Gulfport, Mississippi. Isn't it beautiful? Okay, look at that coastline. I just want to say, see, I was fed by water. I played in water. I smelled water. I'm from a coastal city. Now, I know that when many of you think about Mississippi, you don't think about that, but that's my Mississippi. And so what happens is that now in there, I want you to know I have Choctaw heritage because they cultivated that land, and I am a descendant of Black sharecroppers. You can see me just chilling on the beach. You see the lighthouse, you see the water keys. My hometown is 80 miles east of New Orleans, right? Absolutely beautiful. So my interest very early on was cultivated because, again, I enjoy. My diet was fish. Fish comes from where? Right? Every Friday, you're going to have some fish or something like that. You're going to have some gumbo. You're going to have something that is related to that land. Now, here is my hometown. Now, here's the beautiful part of my hometown. Now, here's the hot mess of my hometown. Okay. Now, what happens is this is a statue. Now, this is a statue that was built in 1911. It's 25 feet of bronze and granite. It's a Confederate statue, right? Now, my hometown is the second largest town in Mississippi. We have 70,000. Mississippi has roughly about 3 million people. We are in the most progressive part of Mississippi. Why? We have military bases there. People come in and out. So it's not like when you see all the television shows, you're seeing like the Mississippi Delta, right? Flat land, very isolated in many ways. This is like a progressive piece. And again, we're on that corridor right outside of a world-class city, which is New Orleans, right? Grew up celebrating Mardi Gras. Right now, we're going to Mardi Gras season and the like sort. And so in my hometown, there is, in order for me, check this out, when I went down to get register my car, when I had to pay taxes, when I had to get a marriage license, I had to go past a Confederate statue. Let me say this. I had to go past it, even do general business to be a citizen. I had to go past a Confederate statue. So what you see here is that, look at the statue, it says here, in the memory of our Confederate dead. Least we forget, meaning in fear that we forget. So therefore, as you can see, the Confederate statue is doing what? A guard, taking the levels of, having this piece of, control in this area. So now what does that mean? I want you to really keep that idea in mind. When the central part of government, the central activities of you being a citizen, or in the case I've already layered it before, here is when I was being a citizen, but how about if I'm going to go get a graduate education? Look at the landscape that I had to go through. This is how, that means every part of the life, just like I said, I smelled water, played in water, and fed by water. Every aspect of my being when I was coming up was in the shadow, in the gaze of a Confederate. Now, what does that mean? So my hometown, the most progressive part. Now, mind you, Mississippi didn't get rid of the Confederate flag. Next slide, Amy. Did not get rid of the Confederate flag until 2020. And it was because of economics, not because the governor had already put his gauntlet down and said they weren't going to change the flag at all. And so what happens is, what you end up happening is that the Confederate, my home area, right? Every little town, every area had decided if they want, their city council decided that they want to take down the flag or not. My area, being the most progressive area, said, yes, let's take down that flag. Long before the rest of the state did. But you all, when it came down to this memorial, it was a different story. So if you can go back one more slide, that would be great. Okay, so what happens is on December 14th, 2020, there was a headline that read in WLOX, that's one of our major television stations. There was a split vote on whether to remove the Confederate statue outside of the Harrison County courthouse. Because of that split vote, it's there because there was no tiebreaker. So it stands. Post George Floyd, post Breonna Taylor, post, Tamir Rice, post stands. It stands. What does that mean? What is the story there? And again, this is going back to sustainability. This is, again, I can even relate this. I can have a lecture right now comparing the Confederate States to the situation in Ukraine and Russia. So pay attention, and this is why sustainability matters. Go to the very next slide. One of the groups that actually, on the northern side of this statue, so you have the statue there. On the northern side of this statue, you will see that it let the people know that it was erected by the Daughters of the Confederacy and by the Board of Supervisors for Harrison County. The daughters paid roughly about $1,500, and the supervisors chipped in $1,000. Now that's important to know, because that means that the people who were making decisions did what? Took money that taxpayers had paid and put it to the statue. Now I want you to sort of keep in mind the year that it was built, 1911. In Mississippi, you're talking about total disfranchisement, or the majority of disfranchisement of Black people. So they had no role. They didn't go to the people's vote and say, hey, let's do this. Many of these decisions, and I'm going to tell you that when I talk about historians, many of these decisions were made by a few people to erect the statue, to put the money there, and the lights. So now let's deal with the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So their aim, as you can see in this piece here, their aim was to praise and preserve Confederate history. So what I'm doing in this particular piece while I'm talking about sustainability is that you always have to go to the background. You always have to go to the history. Okay, you always have to go to the history, and you always have to go to the background. And so, but their goal, their central, when they formed in 1894, their goal was to preserve Confederate history and white supremacy. That was their goal. They were unapologetic for it. They were women who were the elite. Most people do not know the United Daughters of the Confederacy. In fact, just by a show of hands, if the students who have not taken my class, Alexa, you can't raise your hand. If you have not taken my American history class on 152, I would like for you to raise your hand if you know of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and can tell me their history. Again, a student who was not mine in 152 or in my Southern history class. All right. So I have two students who in the back, three who have heard of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. 4, 5. All right. And so now, let me explain to you about this group. So this group was a group of elite women, and they had an objective. Now, I want you to keep in mind that they were active. Their active roles are still today. They're very active today. They're just in the background. But their public persona was basically their heyday was from 1894 to 1920. Okay? And what they did between those years would manifest in two movies that you probably are very familiar with in pop culture. One being a movie called The Birth of a Nation, and the next one is a very cult classic called Gone with the Wind. Now, the Gone with the Wind is truly an example of our Margaret Mitchell, the person who authored that book, is a person who grew up to tell of the lost cause, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And basically, she made that movie around that whole imagery of the story of the United Daughters of the Confederacy created. Now, I want you to keep in mind that not only were these elite white women, but these were women who they had resources, they had means, they had connections. But you all, they had this influence. And guess what? This is a lesson of the UDC that I want you to remember for sustainability. They had no voting power. Women were not voting. They changed the landscape without the right to vote. Now, that's one of the lessons I'm going to talk about when you deal with sustainability. An individual can make a difference because you can put what? Pressure. Let me say that again. So in sustainability, any cause that you want to have, to preserve any type of, let it be if it's as big as Standing Rock or if it's just the local lands in your area, the piece that you can use is precious. And that's one lesson that the United Daughters of the Confederacy shown us very effective. So here what they did was they took these grand sort of, perspectives. Now this is a human Confederate flag. They literally had kids to basically form this Confederate flag. And I tell you here what it says. It says, and twill live in song and story, its foes are in the dust. This was in 1907. This is in Richmond, Virginia. And so these are, this is in Richmond. And so right now in Richmond, they did take down these Confederates in this sort of area that's known as Monument Row. And this is when it was coming up. As you can see from the grand is there. And they had 600 children to form this Confederate flag. So I want you to look at this image. I want it to burn in your memory. Because again, one of the first lessons I told you about was the power of pressure in the individual. The second one is of display, of the grandness. One of the pieces that's going to help take these statues down is what? After George Floyd, when people start to do what? They start to go in and just now start graffiti them and try to mow them down. So now you see this huge display. So when you're looking at sustainability, with voting or not, so this is how you can recruit young people, even though they, for example, people are under 18 and not voting, what happens is that you can still use them, right, and employ them and educate them and tell them that their voice does matter, because in essence, they can help you to create that pressure and display. Now, one of the things that the United Daughters of the Confederacy created was this idea. They had certain tenets that still now shape the American, what do you call it? The American curriculum, right? And so one of the pieces that they have, now this is what you'll sort of learn. As Yankees, and this is what we would call you down south, Yankees. I grew up with calling people who lived in the north Yankees. I had my Uncle Pete, right? Who are basically, if he was here, he'll say, hey, Yankees, that's when he black. That's what they refer to him as, and this is referred to you guys. And so what happens is that one of the components of the learning about the American Civil War was that the Civil War, or we call it the War of Northern Aggression, had nothing to do with slavery, and very little to do with slavery, by way of, starting the war. This is more of an argument about, states' rights, and I'm going to talk about that in a few seconds. Another thing that they said in their myth, and this is all a myth, about how they sustain a certain memory. So after the American Civil War, what happens is the first conversations that historians will tell you about the lost cause was more of this veneration of the valor of the people who celebrated and participated in the Confederacy. At this moment, though, what they did after when the United Daughters of the Confederacy sort of emerged on the scene, what they helped to do was change the whole narrative to basically make it seem as if the South, they really, they put up a gallant and effort that was worthy of praise. So one of the things that they said is that the war was not about the slavery. They said that they created a person that we know, you see her on mops, you saw her on brooms, you saw her in dishpans, and you saw it in movies like Birth of a Nation, or you saw it in Gone with the Wind. In fact, this woman by the name of Hattie McDaniel, the first Black person to ever win an award, won an Academy Award, right, for supporting actress, was a Mammy. Now, the reality is, historically, Mammy was not on the plantation. That's really a post-Civil War creation. That's how powerful the United Daughters of the Confederacy did, because what they did was they now started to create this imagery, again, in coffee pots and cookie jars and the like sort, and all the type of advertising. And they made this idea about Black people being happy, darkies, and slaves. Mammy and Sambo are two of the biggest, and also another character that was really changed in the 1960s was Uncle Tom, but really it was Sambo and Mammy. They minimized, they basically taught that slavery really didn't have that much to do with, the overall What it did, it was like they created this idea that slavery had very little to do with the American economy, right? Not the Southerners did, but the legacy of it going to the North was that that was a Southern issue. And then the North basically heralded itself as being an industrial giant, as if their industrial giant, their cotton and the like sort, was not built on that slave labor. In a second, and I'm going to tell you this now, that the American South produced 3/4 of the cotton production in the world. My ancestors, who were enslaved, produced 3/4 of the cotton used in the world. Great Britain got its cotton from the American South. But now when you're looking at, majority of this, 75% of this cotton from the American South. But when you look at the story of slavery, the way it's in textbook, and many of you are, and I teach, so I know, many of you sort of say, oh, well, that's a Southern thing. It had little to do with anything outside of the South. But in a second, I'm going to show you how powerful it was. What happens is the United Daughters of the Confederacy sort of hit this idea about how slavery was taught. And here, where it goes to sustainability, is this idea of this creation of spaces. Here in this particular slide, here you see Stone Mountain. So what the United Daughters of the Confederacy did was that, so you will know, anytime there was any civil rights activity, they would build more statues. There is a correlation. I want you to know, anytime there's building, that there was any type of civil rights activity, they would build statues. We even saw a spike in 2016 and 2016 to 18. We saw a spike in the statues coming up, right? And so what happens is, what they're trying to do, remember earlier when I basically opened up this conversation and I said, what you're trying to tell people about spaces, that space at Ole Miss was not for me. That space going to the courtyard reminded me of the power. So therefore, there's a Stone Mountain. They finished this in the 60s. And this particular piece is it venerates the three Confederate memorial, does a memorial, powerhouses of leadership: Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis. Okay. And so here I have number 5. I have creation of spaces, the creation of space in spaces. What do I mean by that? They use curriculum. In a second, you're going to see they went into people's head. They went into your head. You're in the North, but they went into your head. Your version of American Civil War is actually the story of the lost cause. Okay? They went into your head. They went into your heart. In a second, I'm going to talk about that. And then they went into the landscape. So they changed the iconography. We have over 1,800 statues, or 1,700 statues, Confederate statues. We have over 600 schools that's named after Confederates, many of them in the South. Many of them were attended by kids who are African American. So they went into the iconography. So what did the United Daughters of the Confederacy, some of their arguments that they had, they basically said, now I just want you to listen to, right now in 2022, the United Daughters of Confederacy still teach these catechisms. They give awards and they give scholarships. I want you to remember this because it's going to go to a second lesson. The curriculum and the lesson, the narrative that you have. So sustainability creates narratives, and there is power in narratives. So what the United Daughters of the Confederacy is doing is creating narratives. You see the power of the individual, you see the power of curriculum, and then now you see the power of narrative. So right now, if you go to their website, because you can go to the United Daughters of the Confederacy website, and what they have is that they'll tell you that there's something called Children of the Confederacy. And in these Children of the Confederacy, these are some of the catechisms that they teach kids to get awards. They say, well, what led to the states from 1861 to 1865? They say the disregard on the part of states of the North for the rights of the Southern and slaveholding states. Now, why is that important? So imagine, you know how a catechism works, right? You hear a statement, you give an answer. You hear a statement, you give an answer. Or you have a key word and you automatically have learned it, so it comes across in your mind. And so it says, what is the causes of the Civil War? It's the disregard of Yankees or the North for the rights of Southerners in slaveholding states, right? Now you look at number 3. What were these rights? To regulate their own affairs and the whole slave's property, right? You have it here. Like when I grew up, when I got here to PA, For the first time in my life, I learned that people celebrated the Underground Railroad. Now I serve on the Kenneth Underground Railroad Center. But for the first time in my life, and I went to an historically Black college. I went to graduate school. Where was our region? Where was that? And so I learned that the Underground Railroad is a criminal enterprise that denies people their property. And I get here, and so you can see from my answer, the answer in the catechism, when the northern states, the answer is, when the northern states had sold their properties to the South, what did they do? They organized a party to oppose slavery called the Abolition Party, which advocated the means to abolish slavery with no intent of paying the people of the South for their property. So when I learned that the Underground Railroad and things like that was a criminal enterprise, you understand that was part of the catechism that went into a curriculum that taught me. Narrative making is very important. Some of the other pieces here, let's go to the next page so we can get some questions and answers perhaps in the next few minutes. And so what happens is that, so it has a catechism here. How were slaves treated? With great kindness and care. A cruel master was rare, and he lost the respect of his favors. And what was the feeling of the slaves towards their masters? They were faithful and devoted, and always willing to serve them. Now, these catechisms are still being taught because there's still contests in 2022 to get scholarships. Now, these are people, right, that set legislation. So this is the reason why Mississippi was resistant. Why in my hometown, the most progressive area in Mississippi, when it came down to if you're going to take those memorials down, all of a sudden one of the councilwomen got sick. She couldn't come. It was non-COVID related, according to the paper. She couldn't make it, so it was the time. Because this now has gone into this mindset and creates this. So the power of a narrative when you deal with sustainability is crucial. You see the power of looking at, right, display is crucial. Oh, and how did they behave, those slaves during the war? They nobly protected and cared for the wives and soldiers in the field, the widows without protectors, right? Though often prompted by the enemies of the South to burn and plunder the homes of their masters, they were always true and loyal. And it's still being taught in 2022. They even had, they gave us a measurement. So your textbooks that you read, you still get these stories of the South. For the most part, that's why you've never learned the South as an area of being treasonous or traitors, because they basically had a textbook. And they had a measuring rod, the textbook, and some of the things that they said was that in a book, and you will not pick up one United States history textbook in America today and that will refer to a Confederate soldier as a rebel or a traitor. Okay? You cannot reject a book that says that they fought to kick their slaves. That's why you hear that it's fought for heritage. When we all know there's not one credible historian who will tell you that Mississippi and all of the states in secession, many of the states in secession, they will straight out tell you this is about slavery. You had to reject a textbook that glorified Abraham Lincoln and vilified Jefferson Davis. And so these books said, hey, look, if you're going to say anything about Yankees, and that's good, you got to say something about Southerners as well, right? And so now here, and again, we're wrapping up this piece, getting to the end of this. One of the things that I wanted to sort of point out here is that, so even though the United Daughters of the Confederacy, part of the history that you sort of learn is that slavery was a regional problem, and it was a regional issue, and it only impacted a region. I just want to tell you that 4 million people that were enslaved, that was the second largest slave population in the world, second to Russian serfdom. Okay? That in 1860, on the edge of the Civil War, the enslaved population was worth $3.5 billion. Now, in today's dollars, they'll be worth about $110 billion. So to put it in full piece so you'll understand, the single most valuable asset outside of land in America prior to the American Civil War was that enslaved population, unquestionably. If you take all of American manufacturing in their productive capacity, nothing valued more than that American enslaved population. Yet and still, in your textbooks and what you learn is that it was a regional issue. And that somehow the North was not using the cotton. Now, Northern banks used insurance. The slaves were insurance, collateral, and the like sort. So what is this story telling us about the United Daughters of the Confederacy? Is that, again, you now have created a narrative that mythologizes a history. And so what you're learning is a mythology, not history. You're learning propaganda and not history. And in sustainability pieces, right? Why these spaces are so important is because now imagine if you are you had the fortune to be born, Black, Southern, and a girl in the post-civil rights era, but you're still going to spaces that's basically still dictating you after the civil rights movement what is yours and what is not yours. So when you're looking at topography, or when you're looking at topography and landscape and what these icons and this iconography means, right? Let it be preserving water, let it be preserving natural space, right? What happens is you have to create something that's not divisive, that's inviting, that's community oriented, not something that alienates, signals power. Okay? This is why, by the way, the American Revolution, one of the first things that they did in New York when they started and had the plan, the independence, was they tore down the statue of King George. The statues are the first things to go, monuments. I'm going to now begin ready to wrap it up in some of this. So what happens is, what can we learn from the strategies of the UDC? We see the power of narratives and how does that go to sustainability. We see what divisive narratives can do. It's the force of history. You have to know the background. In any area you go, for example, right now at Mount Rushmore, when President Trump was trying to have his kickoff campaign there, he went with protest because if you know the story of Mount Rushmore, right, then you know why the Indians would have problems with him being there. How that land was taken, how they refused, even to this day, even though they've been offered millions of dollars for the land, we don't want your money, we want the land. But if you don't know the history, then you don't understand the sustainability issues and things like COINTELPRO that got to thinking these people are tree huggers. They're trying to stop the pipeline. Don't you know how many jobs can come from all of these types of conversations that go with sustainability? If you don't know the history, you're going to be sitting around here buying the propaganda, stuff like the United Daughters of the Confederacy days. And you're going to be giving an answer from propaganda, not from truth. All right? Of the power of individuals, of collective action, and of legislation. One of the things that the United Daughters of the Confederacy did in places like the Arlington Cemetery was that they basically used legislators and legislation to get it. In Arlington Cemetery, you know, the history is supposed to be a cemetery that's dedicated to people who served the United States, but the United Daughters of the Confederacy were so effective, they were able to get a Confederate memorial in Arlington Cemetery, you know, the very cemetery that's supposed to be honoring initially the Union dead. They were able to get the Confederates in there who were treasonous against the Union. That shows you the effectiveness of a narrative. Also, you see the effectiveness of this. People who are like me, younger than I am, who grew up in the South, Dylan Roof, you see he's burning the American flag and he's waving the Confederate flag because he saw the American flag had lost all of this, you know, effectiveness, right? And so basically it was the Confederate flag that represented the real truth of America, not the American flag. Dylan Roof would be a young man, he would go in, he would pray with African Americans, and then he would murder them after that prayer. 9 in the oldest church in Charleston, South Carolina, Emmanuel AME. All right? He did that in 2015. You saw it also, and you all are old enough to remember the Unite the Right rally that was in Charlottesville What happens is that in August of 2017, what they end up doing was they end up, these young people, people who are your age, they had now bought into this narrative about the symbolism and the power of the narratives of those Confederates, and they were there to do what? Keep the statue of Robert E. Lee up. That's the power of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and that's the power of narrative. At this moment, what does historians say? Historians say that we should keep the statues. You just need to put them in context. And they need to go to museums. Okay? They don't need to be in public space. Okay? How do people treat their local narratives? That depends upon a collective action, like in areas like in Richmond, what they're doing now is they gave the Confederate statues to the Black African American Museum there. Have the people to participate in the narrative. What are some of the other possible uses? I mean, I was thinking about areas, and that is you can do bicycle. I mean, you can have bicycle parks. You can have, information centers. You can have a peace garden. When they're taking down some of these statues, depending upon how much land they have, you can do a community garden. You can do anything that's build community and have people to make collective decision making. So the uses are endless. It's according to how much space is available. Again, you can have from the bicycle parks to community areas. And now, what I want you to do since you're here is that I told you that this is radical. And I'm talking to you two people who are on the Zoom. I'm writing a letter to my hometown. And I'm telling them to take that statue down. Right? And so therefore, the collective action, because this is now the part about the sustainability, this is sustainability in activism, right? Is that when I create that, I want you to send me an email, and I want you to tell me you don't mind signing the petition with me. And that letter is going to go to the Gulfport, Harrison County commissioners, and we're going to try to get that statue down through collective action. So this was not something where you just come in here and listen to me talk. It's about real activism. And so now I told you the power of the individual. And as we say at home, and I end my speech here, you either mess or get off the pot. You have to understand, you know what that means. But anyway, all right. All right, so are there any questions? So we only have a few seconds. Only got 3 minutes. Any questions? Any questions? I don't see any on the screen, but we do have some good participants in that room. Yes, yes. Your name?
Oh, Tristan.
Tristan,
I know you were just talking about they want to put the statues in museums. I feel like I like that idea simply because I feel like if the statues are taken down, then we're going to be repeating this cycle of we forget history because we take the statues down, and then it's going to be like, okay, well the statue is gone, and then you know how weird it does. It's like, okay, well the statues are gone, we don't need to talk about what happened. So I guess
we should use them like they did right now in Germany. We should use those spaces of trauma and those spaces of division and use them as an educational center in any way possible. But we should not destroy them. We should not get rid of them. We should now tell the story around them. And that's what the general consensus is of American Historical Association and the Organization of American Historians. Both of them say that. And I think most people agree. I have three more people here. So I don't see any hands on here on the chat, and then we have to end. Yes.
I'm just curious, is there any reason why they aren't taken down?
Because most of them did not come up until 40 years after the American Civil War. This is anytime there was activity with civil rights, that's when they went up. So they were coming up in the 50s and 60s.
I know they said that when we got our independence, the King George statue was the first to come down. Yeah. It's just ironic because if you look into the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson actually blames him for the students they were coming over here. The president at the time or people of government would have their statue moved right away, going off of their
Yes, and so with that, what happens is that, that's the piece, because that statue was up prior to the American Revolution. So there's that sinister part of it about the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They were building statues and creating narratives after the American Civil War. And so that actually makes it way more dangerous because now you have what? They can create a narrative that is in mythology, and that's what they do. And then we have one more question. One more,
telling the story from that side, like what you said,
And you agree with the governor of Virginia. That was one of the reasons why they wanted to do it. They want to be able to tell a story from people who had been victimized, and again, who had to pay. I'm still paying for that. I have a land in Mississippi. I'm still paying for that statue in the Harrison County. My taxpayers go to clean that statue, to maintain that statue. Right? In all of these areas, who's keeping them up? So you're now paying for something that you had no voice in actually ever erecting. Last question, I saw one more. Is it online or somebody over here?
Yeah.
Mhm.
What kind of use do you see for this space from the tax?
Dependent upon their size, I would love to see either peace centers, or I like to see solar panels being used. I would like to see community gardens that come up. I would like to see, areas where, again, depending upon the space, where you can have a mobilization piece. Now, so you can have a mobilization piece where people sort of understand that to be like a public lyceum, where they go there and they debate things out, like in the old particular piece. And so that's how those are some of the ways that we can see those spaces. And last comment, yeah.
So it looks like for the past like decade and a half, we've seen this narrative about that the Daughters of Confederacy have promoted, and now it's so great in our society. And now with like internet and social media, that we have spaces where that narrative is still permanent and unbreakable in many aspects. What do you think could be done to try and spread education and try and educate people about really what did happen?
One of the ways that we can do, and I do see a question, Tyler. One of the things that we can do is sort of help because so you can see the United Daughters of Confederacy were very active in basically spreading misinformation that went into the curriculum. One of the ways that you can do is actually counter the information and do exactly what I'm saying: participating forums, write petitions. Because one thing about historians, we go to records. We like to see what the people are actually saying. And so therefore, what we do to create those new narratives, again, to continue to promote this education and awareness. Like again, when I start teaching about the United Daughters of the Confederacy, 99% of my people don't even know about it. A group that actually has influenced their life and the curriculum and their understanding of the war, and they don't even know who they are. So basically, even just saying their names, and that's a different way to say their names, but saying their names and what they did is important. Thank you so much, you all, and I know it's time, so thank you. Give me a round of applause. Make sure the team has signed that roll, and I will talk to you later. Peace and progress. Thank you.